These memories of work with children are directed to those who try to give stability to children in this troubled world, to social workers, nurses, and child development specialists, to students of psychology and psychiatry, to all those who have the power to plan for children and stand for their rights and opportunities. In order to have you participate in my development as an educator, from first well children under the guidance of Maria Montessori, whom you see here, to those of sick children in a county hospital, I would like to demonstrate that to you with some slides. Here you see the work group of young women who started the first Montessori school in Vienna in 1922, and how young we all were. Here you see another aspect of what we learned in these very early days, namely that children who live in a poverty area need to go out to the country and be amongst animals and plants. And so at age 17, I organized a summer camp. It was actually a spring camp for the children of the school, and here they are amongst the cows. Or here you see, transferred already to the hospital setting, to the first group of tubercular children. It was this interaction which brought about the ease of tensions for children who were separated from their families. This is a slide which I'm particularly fond of because it shows a 13-year-old wheeling around a little girl of different race. As it happened, the older child died the next day, and that was her last joy, to be of service to this little one. In the Vienna school, we got the present of a microscope from the Zeiss Works in Jena, which had a similar sort of school and offered us that as a friendship present. So I was not uneasy to prepare some sessions with the microscope for a polio patient. I knew how children profited by working with the microscope. He had the additional joy of getting the doctor's lab once a week for his special purposes. Or one has to learn to work with a child who is as miserably off as this boy after some very severe third-degree burns. But he was eager to come to the playroom and to blow bubbles into the water. You can see how distorted his face looks, how his ear is gone, but still play mattered. Now again to some activities. Back to Vienna, a 2-year-old working with the Montessori frame for buttoning with the whole intensity which a 2-year-old can master. And then another group immediately after the war, when I was back there trying to help each other get dressed. And a child in the hospital with palsy who was annoyed that my smock wasn't buttoned. Again, Vienna, children helping to get the soup on the table by cutting the vegetables. And children at the hospital here who were cutting up apples and cooking them for applesauce. This is a drawing by Käthe Kollwitz, and it's called A Visit to the Hospital. The child seems to be much relieved to have both parents there, and that was at a very early time when nobody spelled it out that parents were important, so the child was in the hospital. And that, in contrast, is a child whose parents could not be with her when she was hospitalized. But there, of course, we had to fill in. And there you see her in the middle, after 2 months in the hospital. A gay child, a child who could relate to others, who felt at ease. It's not only parents who matter. It's very important that medical students can learn what it means also to play with a child, not only how to treat a child. And here is our last slide, which taught me something important. We thought, when we opened the nursery school for tubercular children, the I call it nursery school because it functioned as such within their unit. We thought, well, maybe the children should be 2 years old before they entered the playroom. And on her first birthday, you can see she is very elegantly dressed for it. She just insisted of coming along. And she was playing with clay and being as absorbed as everybody else. And that, I think, was the last push I needed to realize that regular divisions by age or by illness were not important. What was important was that one could help each individual child do something he was vitally interested in.
Mrs. Plank, or Nushi, if I may, as a former student of yours, I've been a recipient of so much of your wisdom and been witness to your philosophy as it applies to children and child life. I know that the impact goes so much further. What were the influences in your life that led to your concern for children and that later did evolve into the profession of child life?
Well, I grew up in a typical apartment, as practically all Viennese children did, with the exception that my mother fled to the country as soon as we possibly could get away from school or be out. And there was are my really good childhood memories. I remember how I learned how to swim at age 5. My mother taught me, who had just learned before that how to swim herself in order to teach me. So to show you how the relationship to nature and to do the physical things were important in my early childhood. I really grew up as a single child because my brother was born 7.5 years after me. And I think his being that much younger must have been quite a bit to do with my interest in becoming a teacher. I think from the early beginning he had, there was this relationship of the older sister of my little brother. And so these are, when school started, and I was quite young, I had to take a special exam to be allowed to start school before I was 6. I got very, very involved in school. It was a typical school of the days, and I think it still exists this way now, that there were no boys in the whole schoolhouse. There were only girls, so there are boys' schools and girls' schools. But we had the advantage of having a school which was attached to a teacher training institution. And as we got a little older, we of course fell in love with some of the practice teachers. And that was, have some very good memories for me. And it also shows somehow the importance my parents paid to education. One had to pay for this school and one had to pay for my high school. And though that was not easy, my father was working for the government and the incomes were rather restricted, that was taken for granted. That I would have greater advantages in these schools than in others, and that was done.
And your father was an intellectual too.
Oh, very much so. And we joked, you know, and said, well, if once he retires, maybe he would like to become a Buddhist priest because his reading and history and these things were of great importance for him.
After World War I, the experiences that you had even more clearly show your sensitivity to the needs of children. I know you mentioned one that your mother sought out right after World War I, a camp in Austria to send you to that was quite a unique experience.
That was unique. I don't think that people who live on this continent can really visualize what World War I meant to those who were in the midst of it. And I think Austria was probably worst hit because not only did the empire collapse, but from a country of 56 million emerged a country of 7 million. With beautiful mountains and lakes, but nothing to feed the population with. So these were difficult times and very trying times for mothers to see that their children had what they always wanted to give them. So when the opportunity arose when I was 13, that was a few months after the end of the war, to send me to a summer camp where at least the mountain air would be as it used to be. She took advantage of it, not knowing, as none of us did know, that this was really a milestone in the development of many of us, because it brought, I think, about 200 girls ages 13 to 18, as the high school years, with 20 boys who were handpicked. They were usually older. I mean, the youngest I remember was between 15 and 16. So you can imagine that I was on the lowest level. I was 13. There was no chance to be even interested in any of the boys. There were much better objects for that. But there were some very unusual people there. For instance, Rudolf Serkin, who is certainly known to many people today as a pianist, was one of the boys.
This really was your first group experience.
Yes, very much so.
Then she later, really while you were still quite a young teenager, sought out another experience, and that was your stay in Sweden and going to school in Sweden.
Yes, and that again was the outcome of the war, and that I want to stress. The breakdown of everything that existed before was miserable for our elders, but it offered us an opportunity of consciousness of what lay ahead and what needed to be done, which was probably beyond our years. And I was 14 when I came to Sweden. Sweden, along with the other neutral countries like the Scandinavian countries, Holland, Switzerland, had offered hospitality to Viennese children, because it was really quite a problem to feed us. That was shortly, a little over a year after the end of the war, which was almost worse than the war years, because the other parts of the monarchy became independent, so they didn't feel like sending the little foods they had to the capital. So my memories of Sweden are not only those of a typical 14-year-old who learns a language. For instance, that was the first time I really enjoyed learning a foreign language. I had studied French for a long time, but I never really felt that I knew French. But living there, the language became part of our lives, and the songs and the folk dances and slöjd and whatever goes with Swedish education became very, very absorbing to us. And also, along with us, there were some university students there for the same reason, to pick up on their strengths. And I had one of my first idols, one biologist woman who was really set with, imitated her handwriting, all the typical adolescent things. But we were intrigued by science through her, And when I came back at the end of 9 months, I was invited to stay longer, but I really wanted to be back and being able to continue with my own class and my own environment. When I came back, somehow Vienna looked very different. I had seen what a country without war and without aggression, or obvious aggression, could accomplish. And I came back with a very determined idea that I wanted to become an educator. And quite a few of the conflicts I had with my mother in adolescence came from this determination, which probably would not have developed if I had not been separated from the family. So in a way, though I gave her some hard years, I think it was very good for me.
She had other ideas, didn't she, when you returned, or at least offered another choice?
Yes, well, and she was probably very right from her point of view. While I was 15, no, I must have been 16 by that time, I got Maria Montessori's book into my hands. And in order to understand that, one has to say that there were no public libraries or no libraries for children. We had no school library. That means in order to read, one had either to belong to a private library club, which my mother belonged to, but I don't think they had children's books or any books which would interest me, or one had to own books, or one had to have friends who owned those books one didn't own, and one could exchange it. And so I got the Montessori book from a friend who had gotten it from another friend. And throughout my high school years, which were 6 years, I had a very intimate friend who lived close enough from us that we could really spend all our afternoon together. We had our French lessons, which were outside of school, to give us some chance to learn how to talk together. And I spent practically every afternoon with her. And she, in turn, spent the summer months when one couldn't leave Vienna with us, where we had a victory garden. And that again shows the initiative of my mother. You know, she took that initiative, and we had this victory garden, which we didn't do much work, but there was an old blind horse and a wagon, and we could just sit there and dream or help once in a while, but we didn't. So this friendship was a very intense one, and the two of us decided to look into the possibility to be accepted as apprentices at the Montessori school, of which we had just heard that it would open through a coincidence, through the older sister of my friends. And so we investigated it and got just thrilled at the opportunity it seemed to offer, and were received with pleasure, because there was no money to pay some trained people. So we 16-year-olds were received as trainees with the understandings that we would do some work. And the two of us were put in the kitchen. And luckily, the summer before, we had both been involved in leading a camp for 40 younger children in one of the most beautiful parts of Austria. Actually, it was a former castle, which at that point was what we would call a ruin. It had no more windows, and there was no electricity. It was, as it should be, on a hill above the valley in the Dolomites. It was really superb.
And you organized this camp pretty much on your own, didn't you?
Well, the two of us. And as a matter of fact, I don't understand really how the 40 parents trusted us. But evidently we were all so serious about it. And we had the help. And that I forgot to mention before. After I came back from Sweden, school seemed empty. There was something that was lacking in contact with people, and which my friend could not make up for. You know, it needed some broader base. And I don't know how I heard about it, but I heard about a group of youngsters who were under the leadership of the wife of, I think, one of the top Boy Scouts leaders in the city. And I went to that group, which was really very exciting, because all sorts of romance went on in terms of literature and music. The two Serkin sisters were there. And again, it was again a select group, but only girls, of gifted, I shouldn't even say gifted, but of involved young people, some of them very gifted. And so I started out there and went to camp the year before we organized the camp. My friend was not there yet. She joined in next fall.
Was there a sense of confidence and a sense of being able to accomplish something? Was that prevalent among many of the youth in Austria?
Very definitely. Time? You know, if something collapses as completely as this monarchy had collapsed after the end of the war, and all the facilities of a state had to be rebuilt. In very simple terms, we felt the older generation had brought us in this mess, but we will lead out of it.
So you really had strength and really felt that you could master and do something for the...
At least we were optimistic enough to think that what we did mattered.
Nushi, we last talked about Lily Peller, and that connected with the Vienna Montessori School. She was a very important person in your life, and one that was so important that she was even the subject of a book you wrote in 1978. Tell us more about Lily Peller and why she was such a strong influence in your life.
I think her ability to relate to people who knew much less than she did, and to point out the things that were important, like the environment of children in terms of architecture, in terms of art, psychological insights when she directed us to get acquainted with psychoanalysis and Anna Freud. Practically everything that turned to be important in our education, to become educators, started out with her prodding it or with her demonstrating it.
Tell us about your training then at the Montessori school.
Well, that was quite interesting because we started really as 16-year-olds in running the kitchen. And we were not very good at it, but the food that was available wasn't very good either, so we could manage pretty well to cook potatoes and cook quick oats and this sort of thing. But the one thing that was built into this work in the kitchen was to have the children along in a perfectly well-organized corner for kitchen work for young children. A low sink that really worked, a low table with blunted knives where they could cut. After 2 years of that, I had a chance of a semester of study in Holland, which was just at the end of a course Dr. Montessori had given there, but time enough to visit the schools, which at that time were the best schools in Europe, because Holland, not having been part of the war, was developed very well that way. I think that's when my interest in the older children began, as I eventually started out to be the elementary school teacher in the Montessori method and in Vienna. And that again was helped by the persistence of my mother that if I chose this career, I should at least have a decent degree. So I went to the teachers' college for 1 semester and came out with my degree as an elementary and kindergarten teacher, which just was a basis, but not really added very much to my knowledge. But what really added to my knowledge were 2 summers I could spend at a biological station of the University of Vienna at a lake in the Alps, which studied the ecology of water, both of the lake and of the contributaries of the lake, where we would go into the mountains. And this combination of work with the microscope was meant to really sharpen our perception and observation. And it certainly did a lot for me.
You stayed at the Montessori school in Vienna until about 1938. And that was pre-World War II. The tensions became very, very great. You tell us about this time.
Well, you see, this time was not only pre-World War II, but for Austrians was the takeover of Austria by the Nazis. That means we stopped being a country of our own and became part of the German Reich, which at that time meant that all the prosecutions that had happened in Germany to not only Jewish people, but also those who looked at life from the left and disagreed with the Nazi doctrines on these reasons, got persecuted, and persecuted in a very frightening way. And we had a little taste of it, taste enough to know that we better look to get out as fast as we can. Well, our passports were gone. They searched our apartment and took the passports. So in order to get the passports back, Robert had to dissolve his office.
His law practice.
Yes, I mean, he had just started to have his own shingle out. And really he dissolved the practice of his friend with whom he shared the practice, who was not Jewish, but who was a correspondent for some English papers, and so couldn't do that anymore from Vienna, but went to Prague and then finally to London. And in order to get our passports back, he submitted the whole office to a Nazi attorney, and at least after 3 months we had our passports. Now, it sounds easy to leave. You just go on a train and leave. Well, it wasn't all that easy, because between the train and getting off the train were several frontiers, and you had to have documents to cross the frontiers. Looking back now, nobody was very friendly. The Swiss let get you through, but they didn't let you stay. The French were already very uneasy in 38, and one knew it wouldn't make sense to try to settle in France. The English let you in if you had a letter of invitations, which you got through our friend, but also only if you had hopes to leave England again, which we did because we had already an affidavit of support which was needed to get into this country. And the Americans were amazingly responsive to the needs of this group of sudden refugees who had to get out. But of course the bureaucracy worked slowly, and the quota numbers were set, so one had to wait until one's quota number came. So we had a very interesting experience of spending 3 months in London waiting for our quota number so we could get to this country. And through these 3 months, and I mention that because this was the first thing that I think qualified me for work with sick children afterwards. We were in charge of a home for Basque children. May not mean anything to listeners today, but the Basque country was the first country bombed in the experience of people born after 1900. The first children bombed in the city of Bilbao, in the Basque country, by the Franco troops. And British warship picked up these children, brought them to England, and we were asked, that was already a year and a half before we came, to take over one of these homes of 36 people. And it was fascinating.
Then you were on your way to the United States.
Yes.
Where did you go when you first came here?
Well, of course, we landed in New York.
Yes.
And we came directly from the Basque Children's Home to a Dutch ship and landed in New York. I got already seasick while the ship wasn't moving yet. it was a not easy departure from the old continent. We landed in New York, and our affidavit, that means the responsibility of somebody taking responsibility that we would not be a public burden until we were citizens. That means for the first 5 years of our American life, somebody had to assume responsibility in case we couldn't support ourselves. And we had 2 sisters who Robert hadn't met them. I had met at some of their visits in Europe when they came to see our school and were very intrigued by it. They attended Dr. Montessori's training course in 1913 in Rome. So you can imagine how far back that goes.
Yes.
And one of them had her PhD in psychology. The other one was a psychiatric social worker from Smith. Now, the social worker lived in San Francisco. That's where they were from. And the other sister lived in New York. And she said, as soon as we arrived, well, you better go on right to San Francisco.
When you got to San Francisco, after a period of time, you became affiliated with the Presidio Hill School. Is that right?
Yes, which was a small private school, very similar to the one we had in Vienna, different in its focus. It was a parent cooperative and ran through junior high. And I think started out with the 5th grade. And but the important person at Presidio Hill was its director, Josephine Duvenek.
Yes.
I just remember when I got my citizenship, Robert was in the service then, she gave me a book by Walt Whitman with a very lovely inscription of greeting me as a fellow American. You know, things of that sort.
Yeah. And during World War II, Robert actually was in the service for America.
Yes, I should say for America.
Yes.
Yes, he was drafted in 43, was sent abroad in summer 44, and his group was in the Battle of the Bulge. So there were some moments which were not quite comfortable.
Yes, in 1946, then, you'd been to Presidio Hill Schools, had been with Presidio Hill Schools until this time. You went to Mills College as a graduate student.
Christmas 46, I got a letter from Vienna from the man who at the time I worked there was in charge of all preschool education for the city of Vienna, and who also was the man who got Anna Freud to give her first lectures to kindergarten teachers and published book on that. So somebody who was really in the same trend in ideologically we were in. And how he got my address, I don't know. But he wrote and said, couldn't I come to Vienna, not as their employee, independently, and help him set up a demonstration center and help him with the retraining of the kindergarten teachers.
Yes.
Kindergarten in Austria means 2 to 6. I couldn't quite see how I could possibly go to Vienna, but it was exceedingly tempting. To the idea of rebuilding something,
Yes.
which one was really very fond of.
Yes.
And the idea, also my brother and his family were back in Vienna. That was another strong reason for me to want to see them and be back. Well, to make a long story short, I found a foundation which was even in San Francisco. That means I could talk to people personally after Robert and I had worked out a plan. And they made a very wise decision. The grant was $8,000. The grant carried me back and forth between Vienna and San Francisco and supported me for 2 years. So it's nice to hear that this was possible.
That's right.
Not only that, but also got some equipment which one couldn't possibly get there, like silverware for the children and other things which I would carry back from here.
Yeah.
Well, anyhow, the $8,000 did it, and that was the proviso of the grant, and I think something which was a lifesaver for me. They wouldn't give it to me as a person, but would give it to an organization.
Yes.
And there Mrs. Duvenek again came in with her Quaker relationships. And it was taken on as a project of the American Friends Service Committee in Vienna.
Then you returned to the United States, and
While we were still in Vienna, I got a letter from Cleveland. Would I consider coming to Cleveland? And I started to laugh and said, I was crazy. Why in the world should I leave San Francisco, which I love so? And we had a funny little house there at that point. And so everything was pointing to San Francisco. When I came back, the Korean War was on, and things had sort of stagnated. The Department of Child Development at Mills had closed. There was so this was gone. I did not want to return to Presidio Hill School. So I did a few things which again proved helpful afterwards, but which were not comparable with the scope I have had before. And so when the second letter came from Cleveland, wouldn't I consider coming and setting up a nursery school for children with emotional problems under the auspices of university hospitals and the Department of Psychiatry of the university? I felt much more tempted. Then the third letter came and said, wouldn't I come at a certain time? Anna Freud is coming and giving a lecture. So
in 1950, then, you
fall of
officially
50,
moved to Cleveland.
Yes.
And Dr. Douglas Bond and Dr.
Annika Tan.
Yes. Tell us about what you did.
Well, the task was to reshape a house which was on Abington Road, a lovely private house which belonged to one of the doctors, to change that into a nursery school for children with difficulties. And the part of the whole concept was to work with the mothers. And Annika Tan, who is a psychoanalyst and whose youngster I had in school for 5 years in Vienna, so who knew me as an educator, wanted to set it up with some of the child therapists trained in London. So she imported all of us more or less, one after the other. So I had great enjoyment in getting this house into a children's house. That's what we called it. And it worked very well for a while, and then there were 3 child therapists, and then the situation was such that education wasn't considered the important part, but the therapy, and that wasn't for me. And I switched to a teaching function because there was no training for early childhood education at the university. And I started a graduate training for under the Department of Education and Child Psychiatry, not child psychiatry, psychiatry. And during that time, then the switch came, which led me to consider sick children.
Yes. And that was, around 1953, Dr. Frederick Robbins sought you out. At that point, he was the director of the Department of Pediatrics and Contagious Disease. Is that
That's right.
At Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital?
Yeah, at that time it was still called City Hospital, and was very much of a rundown physical facility. Dr. Robbins had just come to Cleveland the year before as a polio specialist and had one of the worst polio epidemics behind him. And at that point also had to do some planning for children who were long-term patients, namely children under the age of 6 who had tuberculosis.
Yes.
Which the tuberculosis sanitarium did not accept, not before. You know, all these things you just wonder about.
Yeah, you do.
But so here he was with a full pavilion of polio patients and some 10, 12, 15 TBs running around who were well because they were under chemotherapy, but who needed to be hospitalized to be sure that particularly since most of their parents were not active but hospitalized, they had given it to the children. Well, at that point, I needed a project to for some of the graduate students to develop something which was child right for children.
Yes.
And also, in whatever I did, I always combined teaching with the actual living situation with children. And so that part was missing. One was very isolated in the education department over there. And that wasn't exactly, so I grasped the opportunity and said, it's great, let's take it. And 3 of my students and I looked at this very old building, and we changed it into a unit which had plenty of space, you know, that was great, of course, into a unit for 15 tubercular preschoolers.
It was how you made the transition from the well child now into a hospital setting.
That's right, because you see, it wasn't very much of a transition. These children functioned more or less like well children without a family. So here were the Basque children, well children without a family.
That's right.
And there was the age group I had trained for at Mills, the very young ones. So all that fitted together, and we equipped that, and so I handed it over to Dr. Robbins, and he said, well, would you write some proposal for a foundation grant, because I think it would be nice if one could carry it over after your students left. And so I wrote him a proposal and gave it to him and said, do you know anybody who could run it? I said, give me some time, I'll find somebody. He said, don't think. Would you take it on? And by that time I had already gotten a little bit of that feeling of the department and was really delighted to be asked to take it on.
And by, 1957, child life was really on its own as a profession and as a department under the Department of Pediatrics at Metro.
Yes, and that has been I tried to convince so many of the departments that are starting, start if the head of the medical head of the department wants it and supports you.
Yes.
And don't start under administration, under nursing, under social work. It brings additional problems.
Yes.
Start under those who take care, who are responsible for the children, and also are responsible for the budget.
Yes.
So we got the foundation grant for the first 2 years, and then Dr. Robbins said that we have demonstrated enough, the hospital has to take it over.
It appears that the 50s and 60s were a ripe kind of climate for the development of the concepts of child life or emotional aspects of care of hospitalized children.
Very much so. And, you know, in preparing for these interviews, I looked through some of my old files, and I am not very well organized in all that. But I found one program here, which we had started in April '58. That means 3 years after the program really came into which was called Child Life and Education for Hospitalized Children.
And this was at the county hospital, or
At
city
the-
hospital.
At the
That's
city
what we call
hospital
it,
still,
Metro
yes.
now.
Yes. No, it was already county hospital at the time.
Name
Just see on the
change,
program,
yeah.
yeah. So, and there we got some help from Cincinnati. Cincinnati under child psychiatry, as well as Taft under child psychiatry, had programs. And we got the head of child psychiatry to be with us, and the rest were our own people.
So
Now,
people were thinking along these lines
oh,
elsewhere
definitely,
too.
definitely.
Yeah,
There is no question. The 50s
yeah.
were a place where these thoughts. Or Mary Brooks from Philadelphia, who had started there also, it came over to that meeting in '58.
Is that right?
Because we had made contacts with each other before at some of the also psychiatric meetings. And so I let her know that we had this meeting here.
Yes.
I had contact also with a project in New York in child psychiatry, where the person who worked on it and her advisor, who was somebody similar to Dr. Wagoner for me, would come. They came in '56 even to see what we did with these little children, because she was working only with very young ones there. So somehow the knowledge spread, and I think it spread because Dr. Robbins had sort of a godfather feeling about it, and he would tell in a joking way and say, we have something you don't have with your fancy buildings. Yeah. We have something here and there. And then some of these people came and asked me to come and tell them what we were doing here.
Well, you wrote your first book, Working with Children in Hospitals, and that was published, what, in 1961?
Yes.
And that also was something that Dr. Robbins was very proud of and
he wrote the preface.
Yes.
And so he, from then on, well, actually, that must have been even a little earlier. When was that? No, 62. That was about the same time. I just found that also, I've completely forgotten about it. That was a scientific meeting sponsored by Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, where all sorts of medical problems were discussed. And I was included to present Preparing Children for Operations. But this inclusion, I think, facilitated the acceptance of the program here and made it easier.
There were other events, too. Robertson in England, is that right, did films on reaction to separation by children. And
very impressive films. And Bowlby's book, which came out very shortly after the war. The war experience had really played a great role in giving an impetus to all the things that mattered here.
That's right.
Separation of families, that came through these early beginnings. Then
Prue was another writer. Is
that's
that
right?
Yes, yes.
Was it 52 or 3? It was fairly early. I'm sorry, I don't. But anyhow, I think it was before Dr. Robbins came to Cleveland, which was 53, because they were at the same time at Boston Children's. And but that didn't get off the ground. It made a beautiful study, a study which is still quoted, but it didn't promote a program.
Not yet, anyway.
Yes. No, the study was perfect.
Yes.
But at that time, the antagonism of probably both administration and pediatricians who were geared to the scientific, under quotes, look at things, and were not quite open to the others.
Metropolitan General Hospital played really a role in giving child life a strong footing, though, by including you in conferences, and also had some conferences that were focused on children. I think you spoke at the scientific one on preparing children for an operation. There was one in 1965 on the mother and child bond.
Yes,
again,
where we had Bowlby even, not Bowlby, Robertson. Robertson brought some of. No, we had some amazing luck in attracting people who were in the limelight at that time. And that's why it felt a little funny. And that brings us to the beginning of organized
That's
child
right.
life.
In 1965, yes.
When I got an invitation to Boston to get together with others who work in children's recreation. Now, I can be pretty snooty if it comes to terms, and I thought, well, recreation, sick children don't need recreation, they need something else.
That's
but
right.
I did go anyway. You know.
Yes.
And there was a group of 25 very engaged people in that field. The invitations had gone to people on the East Coast, which in a way was considered the intellectual life of the country. And I probably was included because the book was out and Dr. Robbins had come from there. And otherwise,
must have been other reasons too.
Otherwise, they may not have thought of as far west as Cleveland. Well, anyhow, I was there. And there came this strong enthusiasm about not letting it go at this one meeting, but trying to get other meetings going and maybe form an organization. And there were 5 of us who then, a year later, when the meeting was, the invitation came from Johns Hopkins, and that was a funny interlude. Boston Children's and Johns Hopkins vied for the privilege of being the most advanced in that field. And it didn't really help the movement very much because the difficulty arose, should that be a professional organization of child life workers? Or should that have a broader umbrella and include other people concerned with the hospitalized child? And finally, at the end of the meeting in Baltimore, the organization got started and would include others. I think with the proviso that they, unless you worked actively in child life, you would not be a voting member.
I see, yes.
On the other hand, we tried, I was the chairman of the first nominated committee, and because I did not want to be nominated, there was this fight between these two outstanding institutions, and I didn't want to be put in the midst of it. But I put 2 men, one from each institution, who were not child life workers, on the board.
I see.
And one was Dr. Brazelton, who has kept his loyalty.
Certainly has.
Until from then on.
Certainly.
So that we tried to have the other professions like nursing, social work, child psychiatry, or pediatrics, always represented on the board. Later on, psychology came in. But child psychiatry has offered many most valuable participants of the board.
When was it officially called the Association for the Care of Children's Health?
I hope I'm correct. That's the name. And well, first it was called the Association for care of Children in Hospitals.
In hospitals, that's right.
Which really fitted it.
Yes.
Then outpatient departments took a major role. Then reaching out into the community of preparing children before they came, all that.
Yes.
So the name, the first name, was given when things were constituted in Baltimore.
In Baltimore. What are your dreams for the future in health care of children, Yoshi?
I had the chance to work with medical students all along, and my dream would be that every medical student should get at least a month where he is free of making medical decisions before he gets a clerkship, and be on a division to play with children, to observe children, to be shown around to different places, let's say a school for the blind, or all these things which a larger community has to offer, so they would know what children are like. And then they can get into what children's illnesses are like.
As a kind of final ending to a very fascinating history to both you and Child Life, would you tell us a little bit about the story of one of your patients that you had at Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, who is now an adult, and a very special
You
story.
see, this is one of the shortcomings of working with sick children, that you have them and then they disappear. Well, this youngster who had hemophilia reappeared, and reappeared when he talked to me in the medical library, and a very young man, a very young man came and said, "Aren't you Mrs. Plank?" And then he reintroduced himself, and we found out we had known each other very well for 12 years. And when he was 10, and he also mentioned he wanted to go to medical school. Now he was somebody who needed a scholarship, and I wasn't quite sure that his health would hold up. So I sent the story he had written when he was 10 years old and hospitalized. Part of it I want to read you now as the end, to the dean of the medical school, who happened to become Dr. Robbins, who was my former chief. So he would know what this boy thought, and that's what he writes.
Now he's 10 when he's writing this story,
Yes.
while you and he
Yes.
were together at Metropolitan.
Yes.
Right.
Most likely, I have a lot more hospital visits ahead of me. But if they discover a cure soon enough, I might just have a few more hospital visits ahead of me. When I grow up, if I get there. I plan to discover a cure for hemophilia if somebody doesn't beat me to it. My other goal in life is to invent an anti-gravity belt or a serum that you can drink to have that power. A lot of people think that this is a silly idea, but I really mean it. People in 1900 laughed at the Wright brothers, and in the future the people of 2000 will laugh at me, but I really mean it. Somehow the circle got closed, that from being a very time-limited person in a hospital, one somehow can follow somebody's development. And he wrote after his pediatric clerkship to me that he really didn't want to become a pediatrician. It's much better to be in the playroom.
Thank you, Nushi. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time to be with you.
Cystic fibrosis is the name given to an inherited disease that results in abnormal mucus production. The effects can vary considerably in severity and body location. The most serious complication usually involves mucus plugging in the lungs, which, in severe form, eventually leads to death by suffocation. However, cystic fibrosis is not a sentence of automatic and quick death, a point often misunderstood by the general public. In Boston, several young adults with cystic fibrosis decided to do something about educating the public, and we think their effort is worth talking about.
I first realized what cystic fibrosis was when I was in grade school. In the 4th grade, when we were lining up to be weighed, and you had your health card. And my health card had this little index tab on it that said CF. And I thought until then that everyone else had CF too. And then as I got older, I realized that this is a killing disease.
2 years ago, 27-year-old Isaac Goldman of Boston became involved in a unique undertaking with 2 other cystic fibrosis patients, the making of a documentary about what it means to live with a chronic disease, one with an average life expectancy of 20 years. The idea for the documentary began with its director, Evelyn Gandolfi, an activities therapist at Boston's Children's Hospital, and a person who has dedicated many years to working with cystic fibrosis patients.
A filmmaker friend of mine came to me and said, look, why don't we do a film about these kids that you work with? You're always talking about them. You're always expressing these deep feelings for them. Why don't we put this down in film so other people can see this? And of course, I jumped at the opportunity. I said, great.
The filming has taken place sporadically over the past 2 years and should be completed sometime this year. It will eventually be distributed nationally to TV stations, universities, and hospitals. The final product will have been a collaboration between Evelyn, the kids, and independent filmmakers Stephen Tringali and Randall Cole. Their goal is to document on videotape the home, work, social, and medical worlds of a few individuals struggling to cope with a disease that ends life at such a young age.
I can't hear you both at the same time. Go ahead.
I don't want us to be on a pedestal and say, oh, wow, look at these people, what they're doing. I think we really have to convey in the documentary that we're ordinary people with just an extra added burden.
It is really the kids who are deciding everything about this film, where to shoot, what issues are to be covered, even the decision to use Leonard Nimoy, who lost his own nephew to cystic fibrosis, as narrator. They are the ones deciding how their lives should be portrayed.
One of the messages that we really want to convey in this documentary is that there is a normalcy to a person's life who has a chronic illness. It's part of you, and so you get on with life, and that's what these kids are doing. They're getting on with their lives. They're going to school, they're dating, they're loving, they are doing all kinds of things. They're crying, they're doing anything that anybody else is doing, and we want to show that in a documentary. Not that they are dying all the time, it's that they are living, and so they want to show that, and I want to show that. I want people to know that these are kids that are living that I'm working with, not just dying kids.
You ready for a go around, my dear?
Oh, I guess
Shall we? Shall we? Shall we?
Do I follow or should we?
Oh, that.
I'll follow.
But dying is part of the story as well. Jean Walsh, 31 years old, was a major participant in the documentary right up until her death 1 month ago. This was among the last footage shot with her.
In the rain, walking side by side, and morning bells will chime, and the wind will whisper your name to me. Little birds will sing along in time, and the leaves will bow down as you walk by, and morning bells will chime. This old guitar has made lots of friends during the years. Entertained the troops in the hospital. It's been a lot of fun. I feel so lucky to be able to enjoy music as much as I do. Sometimes it brings too many tears, but most of the time it brings a lot of joy.
All right. The biggest problem I have with this particular footage is on the day we shot that, Jeannie's here, and we've worked our entire theme around Jeannie being one of the principals, and now she's dead.
Right. Well, my feeling is that when we chose Jeannie, we knew that she was pretty sick, and we didn't expect her to die this quickly, but she did die, and now we're faced with this problem. I feel that this footage is really good footage, and that it shows Jeannie at a really crucial point in her disease and in her life, and I don't think that we should just abandon this piece of footage.
She knew it was too much for her body, but she wanted to do this for the film and for both of us.
Yeah.
She was doing something that she wanted to do and that she knew she would never do again.
What we're thinking about now is like what messages we'd like to get across in this video to people. Like if you were thinking about some basic concepts that you'd like to come out of this.
Okay, I'd say there's always in the back of your mind like this clock that you're really super aware of, and that no matter how hard you try, you can't block it out. It's like there's a natural clock inside of you telling you, live life to the fullest, because you never know when I'm going to stop ticking.
And morning bells will chime,
When we return, a comment about living with chronic disease. Our last story illustrates a theme that all of us would do well to stop and think about, namely the fact that all of us live until we die. Now, that may sound trite and obvious, but for those afflicted with chronic diseases, such as cystic fibrosis, that understanding is often critical to the way in which they live and how others live with them. There is something frightening about having a serious disease that may cause others, at least initially, to feel uncomfortable. But in truth, none of us has a guarantee of long life. And those of us who are so far free of known disease should do everything within our power to live with those who do have a serious disease in such a manner that we make them a part of our world, whenever and however possible. After all, they have a right to a full life just as much as we do. For this edition of Health Beat, I'm Dr. Timothy Johnson.